Hi, I'm Terry Reiber, and I'm your host of the Tea Party Show. Welcome to our second episode. Today we have Catherine White, constitutional scholar, joining us. She's led a number of study groups and has given speeches about the Constitution. Catherine, perhaps you can tell us about your background.
Well, I grew up in Quincy and went to MIT and got a degree in earth sciences. I worked as a materials engineer for about a dozen years and then changed tracks and became a money engineer, and now I'm a tax professional and accountant.
Okay, and do you have like a family and a job?
I do. I have a husband. I have two girls, both of whom are grown. The youngest one is in college and the older one is off on her own. And we live in Lexington. And
So what got you interested in the Constitution?
it's sort of an outgrowth. When the Tea Party movement got started, I joined a group called As a Mom and became the Middlesex County, Massachusetts coordinator. And our monthly meetings sort of evolved into a study group, which then turned into a study group on the U.S. Constitution. And it then expanded to other people rather than just that limited circle, and now we have a couple of dozen people a month who've been coming for 3 years to study the Constitution.
So as well, you've been giving presentations to other groups?
Yes, I've given a number of talks. I've spoken at Brandeis University and several Tea Party groups in various areas in the greater Boston area, and I spoke at a rally, and I've spoken in several other places as well.
Yes, I was there when you spoke at the Repeal Obamacare rally this summer in Boston, and I think you gave a very rousing speech, so we're going to roll a little bit of that footage.
This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges shall be bound thereby. Yeah. Who knew? Definition: to pervert. To turn away from the right course, to misapply, to lead into false judgment. We stand here today because of perversion. Perversion of meaning, perversion of intent, perversion of the Constitution, and perversion of our republic meant to be dedicated to individual freedom and individual responsibility.
Yeah, it was an awesome speech. I know I was in the crowd going, yeah, right on, and just having the harbor in the background, the ships coming in and out. It was really an amazing experience.
And the rain held off.
Yeah, it was a little bit questionable on the rain front, that's for sure. So one of the questions I have for you is, currently there's a lot of discussion about whether our current government and all its functions and departments are actually, according to strict constitutional principles, or operating within strict constitutional principles. So I'm wondering, in your mind, what would a constitutional government look like? What sort of departments or functions would you see that would continue today versus which would not, according to that definition?
The federal government has been overstepping its constitutional bounds for over 100 years now, slowly, bit by bit, creeping into all areas where it was never given jurisdiction. One thing to keep in mind here is that the Constitution was written by people who had come from the states, and the states considered themselves as sovereign entities, and they did not want a federal government that was going to meddle in their internal affairs. So the federal government, federal as in confederation or as in a league, as opposed to a national government. They were not interested in a national government. They wanted a federal government. And they gave, through the mechanism of the Constitution, very specific areas of control to the federal government, and they were uniformly places where you really need sort of a united front, and those are surrounding areas of defense, commerce, dealing with other nations and ambassadors, and some general jurisdiction over ports, which again ties in with international commerce. And pretty much everything else was left to the jurisdiction of the states. So a strict federal government, according to the Constitution, would look very different from what we have today. Almost everything that the federal government meddles in, from food pyramids to toilet standards, is not part of their jurisdiction. Department of Education, that's actually a pretty new department. It only came into existence in the 70s, and there is no constitutional jurisdiction over education given to the federal government, so that one would go.
Mm-hmm.
What else would go?
EPA, for instance?
The Environmental Protection. There are probably some small areas that you could look at under the jurisdiction for commerce to prevent pollution, but that is vastly different from a huge federal agency that monitors everything.
Okay.
They could set standards and then put the states in charge of administering it at the state level. Let's see, what else? Department of Energy, that probably has no constitutional justification.
What about entitlements like Social Security?
Completely unconstitutional. It was sold as part of Roosevelt's
New Deal.
New Deal. It was sold as an insurance program, except that it was promised that it wasn't an insurance program. But it was set up to function like an insurance program, except that it's not an insurance program. And there's absolutely no constitutional jurisdiction or justification for it. That doesn't mean we can take it, turn the spigot off, and be done with it, because there were promises made, and that unconstitutional behemoth would have to be dismantled very carefully and slowly over time. But Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, no constitutional jurisdiction for the federal government.
So the government would then be, excuse me, just defense, military, protection of the borders, collection of taxes, currency, I guess.
Yep. The Congress is given the authority to set the value of the currency and weights and measures, uniform naturalization laws, bankruptcy law. Mm-hmm. That's given to the Congress. What else is given to Congress that I can point out here? Ports, international commerce, dealing with ambassadors. That actually comes under the heading of the executive branch.
Judiciary.
The judiciary is a separate branch, and that is limited again to crimes at the federal level and to anything that comes up between states.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I think the original role of the Supreme Court was simply to intermediate between interstate squabbles and complaints, I guess?
Actually, in any lawsuit that involves a state, the Supreme Court is given original jurisdiction. So the federal lawsuit against Arizona, for example, for the horrible crime of enforcing federal law that the federal government was not enforcing, they brought that suit in a federal court in Arizona. Mm-hmm. Wrong place for it. It says right in Article 3. In any lawsuit where a state is a party, Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. The only place for that is the Supreme Court. And any judge who knows the Constitution would have tossed that lawsuit out instantly, saying, you got the wrong place.
Well, that leads me to the next topic. I mean, people talk about the federal government's encroachment on states' rights, etc. I get the feeling that if the Founding Fathers saw today what the federal government has become, it would have been much larger and much, over-encompassing than anything they'd ever imagined. So, in my mind, what were the checks and balances that were supposed to be in place to keep the federal government within its constitutional boundaries, which in actual fact it appears that it seems to have exceeded beyond that.
It has certainly exceeded far beyond it. There are a number of checks and balances built into the document. First, there are the three federal branches, which is the Congress, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive, and then the judiciary, which the theory was that each of them would be jealous of their own power and so extremely reluctant to see one of the others encroaching.
Right.
But also, again, we come back to the idea that this is a federation, a confederation of sovereign states. And the states were also supposed to be very wary of the federal government encroaching into their areas. Mm-hmm. And the place for them to fight that was the Senate. The Senate was, it's 2 senators per state as opposed to representatives based on population. The Senate was originally conceived to be the ambassadors from the state governments to the federal government. Mm-hmm. And so any bill that came through the House that then has to go to the Senate, the senators were supposed to take a good look and see, wait a minute, this one encroaches on our prerogatives. No, it stops here.
Right.
And with the passage of the 17th Amendment, making the senators elected by popular vote, the states lost their ambassadors mm-hmm. to the federal government. And that, in conjunction with the 16th Amendment, which was the income tax that then gave the federal government more money, you can date the encroachment, the serious encroachment of federal power into areas reserved to the states from the passage of the 16th and 17th Amendments, both of which were in 1913, which is a very bad year for the Constitution.
Right. But also I believe the president, when he's sworn in, he pledges allegiance to the Constitution. So one would think that any bill that would come to his desk, he wouldn't sign if it was not according to the Constitution. Correct?
That is indeed one of his chief functions. The president, and again, because of the way we've grown apart from the Constitution, the president has a lot more power now than he originally had. The president's function as enumerated in this document was more like what we see a hired town manager. Right, mm-hmm. where the selectmen, they meet, they make the rules, and they have a hired town manager who then makes sure that those rules are implemented.
Right.
So the president's function is supposed to be to oversee the implementation of laws passed by Congress that are themselves constitutional.
Right.
He takes an oath to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Mm-hmm. And in fact, every federal officer and many state officers take a separate oath to support and uphold the Constitution. And all of them are supposed to have their eyes open and seeing, no, this is not part of our jurisdiction. We will not vote to pass this bill or this, but they pass it anyways. Then it goes to the Senate. The senators are supposed to be saying, you had no constitutional jurisdiction over this. No, it's not going farther here. Or it encroaches on states' rights. No, it's not going farther than here. They mess up and pass it anyways. It gets to the executive, and then the executive is supposed to say, this is not constitutional. I will veto it, and if you override my veto, I will ask that it not be enforced, because mm-hmm. my duty is to uphold the Constitution, and this is not constitutional. It's not the Supreme Court that has the only say-so on whether or not something is constitutional. The Congress, the executive, the judiciary, and the states all have a say.
So if someone, for instance, felt that Social Security wasn't constitutional, is it realistic that an individual can go to the Supreme Court and argue the case to have it struck down?
If we were living and working with a strict interpretation of the Constitution, first of all, it wouldn't come up. Second of all, yes, they could. As it stands now, the Supreme Court would refuse to hear it based on lack of standing or lack of something or other. One of the problems that we've seen with Supreme Court decisions is that for the last 100+ years, the law schools are not teaching the Constitution. They are teaching constitutional case law. So they're teaching Supreme Court decisions. The problem with teaching decisions is if the meaning of the Constitution is down here and you have a decision back here that deviates just a little, well, you don't really see much of a difference. But if you base the next decision on that, it deviates a little more and deviates a little more and deviates a little more. And after 150 years, you're up here where the intention of the Constitution is down here. So they're teaching case law and they're looking at case law, but we need to look at the original intent of the Constitution. The words in this document were carefully chosen. They agonized over how to write it, and they had fist fights. They had prayer meetings, and they tabled items for weeks and then came back to them until everyone could agree. They meant what they said, and they did their best to craft it carefully. And when you leave behind the original intent, then basically you're saying, anything goes, we'll find a way to justify it. In which case, this is just something to wedge under a wobbly table leg.
Oh, okay. Well, recently we had a fairly controversial decision with Obamacare. I'd just like to hear your take on where the Supreme Court went with that.
There are so many ways the Supreme Court went wrong with that decision. First of all, under Article 1, Section 8, Congress has no jurisdiction over health care at all. There's no way you can read the list of the 17 enumerated powers and say that Congress has power. So from the get-go, it was unconstitutional. Then the whole thing, it's a penalty, it's a tax, it's a penalty, it's a tax, it's a penalty, it's a tax. The administration pushed hard based on the fact that it was not a tax and was actually just a penalty. And then the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to set aside what you said it was and treat it like a tax. It's like, we go back to well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is.
Right.
So, if nothing has any meaning, then we're going to find a way to justify anything, in which case we are no longer living under the rule of law and in fact have abandoned our republic and are now living under tyranny. Because the right people can make any argument to do anything they want.
Well, it sounds to me you can do something unconstitutional as long as you associate a tax or fee with it. You know what I mean?
Well, you can try to do that, but what you are doing is in fact unconstitutional.
Right.
One of the pieces that people forget is states do have a right of nullification. Shortly after 9/11, under Bush, they passed the national ID law. And so many states dug their heels in and said, no, we are not going to institute a national ID. You can just take that and go away. We will not comply. And the national ID law sort of tucked its tail between its legs and went to hide. The states nullified.
Well, that's good.
So the states need to nullify an awful lot more.
Yeah, that would certainly help. I know recently there's been some talk about executive privilege. Perhaps you can talk about the history, the precedents, the use or misuse of executive privilege.
Executive privilege or executive orders?
Executive orders.
Executive orders, okay.
Sorry.
Executive orders are actually permitted in the Constitution, but only to facilitate the constitutional duties of the president. For example, one of the duties of the president is to receive ambassadors. Right. So the president can use executive orders to make sure that there's the appropriate people invited to a state dinner to honor Ambassador so-and-so. The president can issue executive orders to make sure that the executive offices are running properly.
Or following a law.
Following a law, making sure something is implemented. they've implemented a uniform rule of naturalization, which is one of the powers of Congress, and I'm going to, by executive order, appoint somebody to make sure that they're following the law and just keep an eye on them. A president is not allowed to circumvent congressional areas of authority by executive order. So all the new regulations that have come through by executive order are completely unconstitutional. They are null and void and should be, I mean, if Congress was doing its duty, they would simply say, okay, this agency, this group, not constitutional, they get zero funding for their budget.
Right, right.
You can appoint them. They get no money. They can sit in the dark.
Wow, that would be something. I thought we'd spend a few minutes talking about the difference between a democracy and a republic.
A difference between a democracy and a republic. A democracy, Ben Franklin said, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner.
Right, right.
It is mob rule. A lynch mob is pure democracy. A republic is based on laws that no vote of the majority may overturn. So if everybody in a republic votes to deprive you of your house and your car and your retirement accounts, they can all vote. Can't be done, because under a republic, your property belongs to you and you cannot be removed. Your property cannot be removed from you without due process of law. Which could be, you've committed some felony, the punishment for which is to take away your car.
Right, right. Impound
Right.
a car or something like that. Well, I guess we also have a republic it can be changed to some extent. I mean, we can actually go through a process to change the Constitution, correct?
Yes, and in Article 5, there is a procedure for amending the Constitution, which is the only constitutional way to change the Constitution.
Right.
You can't circumvent it by executive order. You can't circumvent it by judicial act. You can't circumvent it by a law passed by Congress. You have to go through the amending procedure, and it takes not just a majority, but it takes a supermajority. It takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress or 2/3 of the legislatures of the states to propose an amendment, and then a 3/4 majority to pass it. It is meant and designed and intended to be a long, convoluted, careful and thoughtful process, because the founders did not want this document amended lightly, quickly, or for passing reasons. It's easy to do something in the heat of the moment that if you really deliberate over the course of several years, you realize maybe that's really not the way to handle this.
Well, you also hear the term, living Constitution, where the people are interpreting the Constitution, correct?
Yes, and that is a form of denigration of the Constitution. The people who got together for months in a hot Philadelphia summer to flesh out this document were trying to do something that had never been done before and has never been done since, which is to found a country based on the concept of sovereignty residing in we the people, where we the people delegate certain enumerated tasks to a federal government, and where rights come from our Creator, come from our humanity, come from God, and not from any government or any government act. They were very cognizant of the fact that governments try to increase their own power, and that they would immediately try to go past the limits of this document. The whole intention was to craft something where it would be very difficult for the government to grow past its powers, because there were so many competing interests fighting to keep every little bit in its own corner. They really meant those limitations. And to say that it's a living document and that we can therefore interpret things that aren't in here as though they were, and take things that are clearly in here and say, well, they didn't really mean that, really denigrates all the work that they put into it and tosses the whole thing out. Because as soon as you say it's a living document that we can read things into, you're basically saying, we will find a way to justify doing anything we bloody well want, and if you don't like it, that's just a real shame for you.
What do you see the future? Do you think people are taking more of an interest in the Constitution?
There is a huge resurgence of interest in the Constitution. There are groups all over the country. There are people like me who are teaching, started out with a little study group, and 3 years later I've got dozens of people every month and requests for talks, little television shows. A lot of people are really interested in this document, what it says, why it says what it says, and how their lives would be significantly improved if we return to these limitations on federal power. So yes, there's a huge interest in the Constitution.
Well, that's great. So if people are interested in finding out more about the Constitution, what can they do?
There's an awful lot of places you can go. There's the National Center for Constitutional Studies online. Hillsdale College has a wonderful Constitution course. There's Michael Badnarik, who was the 2004 Libertarian presidential candidate, has a fabulous book on the Constitution called Good to be King that you can find on his website, which is constitutionpreservation.org. On my website, which is constitutiondecoded.com, I have copies of articles that I have written. There are videos of talks that I've given. There's links to blogs and other websites. There's a retired attorney in Tennessee who's a real constitutional scholar. She publishes a blog under the name of Publius Hulda, and her stuff is absolutely fabulous and extremely thoroughly well researched. So there's a plethora of resources out there for people to get more information. There's the study group that I run every month, and again, on my website you can ask for a speaker for your group, and I'll give anything from 10 or 15 minutes to an hour.
Okay, I appreciate that, Catherine. Thank you very much. And that concludes our second episode of the Tea Party Show, and I hope to look forward to having you watch our next episode. Thanks.